It was a quiet Friday morning at the Brookhaven post office, the kind of morning where the sound of envelopes sliding and stamps pressing filled the small brick building. Susan had arrived at 6:45 a.m., as she had done every weekday for over 20 years. She wore her blue postal shirt neatly pressed, her name tag slightly faded from time, and a small silver pin that read, "Service with Pride." By 8:15 a.m., the routine was in full rhythm. Mail trucks came and went. Customers stopped by for morning deliveries. Susan stood at the counter sorting parcels for the final route before lunch. A customer remembered her smiling and saying, "You will have it by Monday," as she handed over a package. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw her alive. At 8:40 a.m., a co-worker named Margaret Hughes noticed something unusual. The outgoing mail tray had been left half-filled. Susan's pen rested beside it, the ink still wet on the last postmark. Her purse sat on the desk. A half-finished cup of coffee gave off a faint trace of steam. Margaret called her name down the hallway. No answer. The back door leading to the loading dock was unlocked, which was not part of Susan's careful routine. A single envelope had fallen on the concrete step outside, marked with a faint smudge that looked like dirt or grease. Within minutes, staff began checking the nearby parking area. Susan's car, a blue 1986 Buick, was missing. At first, they assumed she had left for a delivery. But her assigned route did not begin until after 10. By 9:15 a.m., concern had turned into alarm. The local police were notified, and Sheriff Tom Landers arrived shortly after. He walked through the small post office, noting how everything appeared normal except for the unnatural quiet. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, and no indication of robbery. It looked as if Susan had simply stepped out and vanished. Investigators questioned the few customers who had been in that morning. One man recalled seeing a light-colored pickup parked near the side alley around 8:30 a.m. Another claimed he saw a woman talking to someone near the loading dock, but could not describe the person clearly. By noon, a search team began sweeping the surrounding streets and wooded paths behind the post office. Officers followed the main road leading toward Highway 84, where locals often parked to make short phone calls from pay booths. Nothing. At 3:45 p.m., a deputy driving along Old Pine Church Road noticed a vehicle hidden partly behind an abandoned chapel surrounded by overgrown grass. It was Susan's Buick. The driver's door was open. The keys still hung from the ignition. Mailbags sat neatly stacked in the back seat. Her purse lay on the passenger side, untouched. Officers sealed off the area. The car was parked as if it had been placed there deliberately. No signs of a struggle nearby, no tire tracks suggesting a chase. But there was something else. Near the rear tire, embedded in the mud, was a single partial shoe print. It was facing away from the vehicle, leading toward the tree line. As dusk settled, crime scene technicians photographed the car, collected fibers, and lifted faint fingerprints from the door handle. The local coroner, assisting at the scene, quietly observed the ground and shook his head. The evidence suggested that Susan had not left voluntarily. Back at the post office, workers stayed late, watching through the windows as flashing lights reflected off the street signs. Margaret sat silently at Susan's desk, staring at the untouched cup of coffee. By the next morning, flyers were printed and distributed across Brookhaven. Missing, Susan Reddick, 45, last seen April 17, 1992. Neighbors joined the search through fields and ditches, calling her name until their voices faded. Within 48 hours, the case had shifted from a missing person to a suspected abduction. Investigators began mapping every mile between the post office and the old church. Dogs tracked the scent for a short distance before losing the trail at the edge of the woods. Sheriff Landers told the press, "We are treating this as an abduction." His words echoed through the small Mississippi town, turning routine gossip into dread. That night, officers left the abandoned church with more questions than answers. The car was towed, the evidence sealed, and the quiet roads of Brookhaven returned to stillness. But for the people who knew Susan Reddick, the woman who delivered their mail, remembered their birthdays, and always asked about their families, nothing felt normal again. Somewhere between her post office counter and that lonely church road, she had disappeared without a sound. and by the time the sun rose the next morning, Brookhaven, Mississippi, would never look the same. Susan Reddick was the kind of person everyone in Brookhaven knew by name. For more than 2 decades, she stood behind the small glass counter of the town's post office, sorting letters, weighing parcels, and greeting each customer with the same calm, steady tone. She never rushed her work, and she never forgot her face. Every morning began the same way, coffee in hand, hair neatly pinned, uniform pressed sharp. To the people of Brookhaven, she was more than a postal worker. She was the quiet rhythm of their everyday lives. Born and raised in Lincoln County, Susan had spent her entire life within a few miles of the same streets she served. She married young, lost her husband to a sudden illness in her 30s, and never remarried. Those who knew her said she carried that loss with quiet dignity. She kept her home on Oak Street tidy and warm, the mailbox always freshly painted. Neighbors often saw her watering the rose bushes by her porch before walking to work, rain or shine. At the post office, Susan's efficiency was legendary. She could recall zip codes from memory, recognize handwriting from across the counter, and remember whose child had just started college or whose father had fallen ill. When customers arrived late with bills or forms, she waited a few extra minutes before closing. It was never a favor, just her way of keeping order and kindness in balance. On Saturdays, she volunteered at the public library, reading to children and organizing local archives. The librarian described her as gentle but exact, the kind of person who corrected a mislabeled file quietly, without calling attention to the mistake after work. Susan often walked home through Main Street, carrying her small handbag and waving to shopkeepers as she passed. People said she had an instinct for comfort, a word of encouragement when someone was struggling, a short note tucked into a package, a steady smile that asked for nothing in return. She lived alone, but she was never lonely. Her friendships were simple, grounded in years of shared trust. Sunday mornings were for church, and evenings for reading in her front room under a yellow lamp that never seemed to burn out. In a town as small as Brookhaven, routines built the shape of life. Susan's was precise, dependable, almost mechanical. That was why, when she did not appear at the post office one morning, the concern spread faster than any official notice could. At first, her co-workers assumed she was delayed. By mid-morning, they knew something was wrong. Susan never missed a shift, never left a message unanswered. Her absence felt unnatural, like a skipped heartbeat in the center of town. By the time her car was discovered near the old church, her name had already passed quietly through every diner, grocery, and gas station in Brookhaven. The woman who carried everyone's letters had suddenly vanished, and for the first time in memory, there was no one behind the counter to say good morning. The Buick sat motionless beneath the shadow of the old church. Late afternoon light stretched across the dirt road as investigators approached, their radios crackling in the heavy Mississippi air. The church had been empty for years, windows boarded, grass waist-high, and the wooden sign barely standing. Susan Reddick's car looked strangely clean against the decay, as if someone had placed it there on purpose. Deputy Wayne Keller was the first to walk up. He saw the driver's door open, the keys still hanging from the ignition, and the faint smell of engine oil drifting from the hood. The interior looked almost untouched. Her purse rested on the passenger seat. A folded paper bag containing her lunch sat beside it. Then came the details that told a different story. On the front floorboard lay a single envelope, torn at the edge. A few letters had spilled onto the gravel outside, their corners damp from the morning dew. Near the gear shift was Susan's wristwatch. The strap snapped cleanly in two. The crystal face had cracked down the middle, its hands frozen at 8:43 a.m. The officers stood silently for a moment, noting every object before marking the perimeter. The ground around the car was uneven, patches of dirt, a few scattered leaves, tire imprints leading nowhere. Near the rear tire, a single shoe print caught the attention of Sheriff Tom Landers. It was partial, pressed deep in the mud, facing away from the car toward the trees. The tread was distinctive, heavy, possibly from a work boot. Forensics arrived before sunset. In 1992, the county team had limited resources. They dusted for fingerprints using fine powder, lifting faint impressions from the driver's door and the rearview mirror. Some belonged to Susan, others were smudged beyond recognition. The lab technician collected fibers from the seat and a hair strand clinging to the headrest. Everything was placed carefully into paper evidence bags, each labeled in neat handwriting: Reddick, Susan, vehicle interior. The vehicle itself offered no clear sign of struggle. The seatbelt was unbuckled, the engine off, and the keys turned halfway in the ignition. Yet something felt wrong. The driver's seat had been pushed slightly back, further than Susan's co-workers said she ever adjusted it. On the steering wheel, faint streaks of dust had been disturbed, not fingerprints, but as if someone had wiped it quickly. Behind the church, search teams combed through tall grass and scattered trash. They found no footprints beyond the first, no discarded clothing, no sign of blood. A small fragment of blue fabric caught one officer's attention, but testing later confirmed it matched Susan's uniform, likely torn in the scuffle that broke her watch. The surrounding woods fell silent as evening approached. The only sounds were the distant hum of insects and the low murmur of radios. Flashlights swept through the trees, cutting pale circles in the dark. The road itself was narrow and unused, a place no one would stumble upon by accident. Whoever had left the car there knew the area well. Sheriff Landers walked around the Buick one last time before turning to his deputies. He looked tired, his eyes fixed on the open driver's door. This was not where she was going, he said quietly, mostly to himself. The search continued into the night. Officers mapped the perimeter, placing numbered flags beside each item. Photographers captured every angle: the cracked watch, the scattered letters, the shoe print dissolving under the weight of their boots. Each detail was catalogued, every inch of dirt sifted through, but the picture remained incomplete. By 10:00 p.m., the crime scene was sealed. The car was towed to the county impound for forensic inspection. The mailbags were locked in evidence storage, still filled with unprocessed letters, as if waiting for Susan to finish her route. At the sheriff's office, Landers reviewed the initial report. No witnesses, no sign of forced entry. No ransom call, only a missing woman, an abandoned car, and a handful of faint traces left in the mud. He stared at the line on the report that read, "Status unknown." Then he stood, adjusted his hat, and addressed the waiting reporters gathered outside the office. His voice was steady, deliberate, and final. "We are treating this as an abduction." Those words carried through the streets of Brookhaven that night, spreading faster than any official bulletin. And as the town locked its doors and switched off its lights, one truth settled quietly in the dark. Somewhere beyond that lonely church road, someone had taken Susan Reddick, and she was not coming home that night. The investigation began before dawn the next morning. Sheriff Tom Landers stood in the narrow hallway of the Brookhaven County Sheriff's Office, reviewing a growing pile of interview notes. The post office staff had been questioned first. Every clerk, driver, and part-time sorter who had worked with Susan Reddick. All told the same story. Susan had no enemies, no debts, and no reason to leave without warning. She was steady, private, and kind. Nothing in her life hinted at danger. By midday, the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation joined the case. They set up a temporary command post in the courthouse basement, filling whiteboards with timelines and maps of the area surrounding the abandoned church. The first public lead came from a mechanic named Henry Calvert, who told deputies he had seen a light-colored pickup parked near the church around 8:30 that morning. He said it looked like a Ford, maybe beige, with a dent in the rear bumper. But when officers canvassed the area, two other residents described something different. One claimed it was a tan Chevrolet, another insisted it was blue-gray. Each said they had seen it from a distance. None could recall the license plate. Over the next 48 hours, rumors began to circulate faster than official reports could contain them. Some said a drifter had been seen at the truck stop on Highway 84 days before the disappearance, asking for directions to Brookhaven. Others whispered about a man from Susan's past, a quiet ex-boyfriend she had dated briefly after her husband's death. A few suggested that someone inside the post office might have known her schedule too well. Detectives followed every path, marking them on the board with colored pins. They interviewed the drifter, who was quickly located in Jackson, His alibi checked out. The ex-boyfriend, a local electrician, was questioned for several hours. His time card placed him at a job site 20 miles away that morning. A coworker confirmed it. Inside the post office, suspicion lingered. One of Susan's colleagues, a delivery driver named Mark Ellison, became the focus of quiet speculation. He had once worked the same route and occasionally borrowed her vehicle during maintenance checks. Investigators interviewed him twice. He appeared cooperative but nervous, explaining that he had not seen Susan in the days leading up to her disappearance. His fingerprints were among those found in her car, but he reminded officers that he often helped load mail bags. The prints proved useless. Each report seemed to end the same way, a line crossed out, a note that read no further action. Forensic results trickled in slowly. The partial fingerprints lifted from the car yielded no matches in state databases. The single hair sample was too degraded for comparison. The shoe print, cast in plaster, was later smudged during handling, leaving only a partial impression. By the end of the week, the search perimeter extended 10 miles beyond the church road. Dozens of volunteers walked through woods, creeks, and open fields. Helicopters scanned the area from above, but nothing surfaced. No footprints, no clothing, no sign of life or struggle. In town, fear began to settle into routine conversation. Coffee shops and grocery aisles became places for speculation. People said Susan must have been followed. Others believed she had been taken by someone she trusted. The more theories spread, the less anyone seemed to know for certain. Investigators logged every call, every rumor, and every anonymous tip. One report claimed that a woman matching Susan's description had been seen walking along a rural highway 2 days later. Another said a man had been seen burying something near the river. Both leads were checked, neither confirmed. Back at the courthouse, Detective Ray Nolan stared at the growing stack of evidence reports. He noticed inconsistencies. Photographs missing labels, samples stored without signatures, documents filed out of order. The case was barely a week old, and already the chain of custody was beginning to fray. On the 10th day, Sheriff Landers called a briefing. The whiteboard, once filled with possibilities, now looked empty, dotted with notes that led nowhere. The team sat in silence as Landers reviewed the evidence list. One of the deputies mentioned that the original shoe print mold had been left in the sun too long and had cracked beyond use. Another admitted that one of the fingerprint cards had been smudged during transfer. Every piece of progress had begun to unravel. Landers placed the report folder on the table, rubbed the edge of his badge, and exhaled slowly. "We follow facts," he said, "not stories." But by that evening, even the facts were fading. Witnesses began to contradict their own statements. New tips stopped arriving. The phone that had rung without pause for days went silent. For the first time since Susan Reddick vanished, Brookhaven had no direction to look. The leads were exhausted, the rumors burned out, and the investigation stood still, a collection of scattered papers, broken molds, and a single photograph of a car by an empty church. The case that had started with urgency was already beginning to slow, and behind the walls of the sheriff's office, a quiet sense of failure began to take hold. The news of Susan Reddick's disappearance spread through Brookhaven before the morning papers could print her name. By Sunday, the town that usually stirred to the sound of church bells and porch conversations had fallen silent. At the post office, the blinds were drawn, the doors locked, and a handwritten sign was taped to the glass. Closed until further notice. The same building that once marked the start of everyone's day now stood as a symbol of unease. For 2 days, mail deliveries stopped. Letters sat stacked inside sorting bins, packages remained unclaimed, and the familiar sound of Susan's measured footsteps never came. People driving past the post office slowed without meaning to, glancing toward the empty parking space where her car had once been. Across Brookhaven, small rituals changed. The diner on Main Street lowered its radio volume, its usual laughter replaced by quiet conversations. At the grocery store, shoppers spoke softly, their words trailing into pauses. Everyone knew Susan. Everyone had a story, a kind word she had said, a favor she had done, a moment when her steady presence had made life feel a little lighter. Her sister, Linda Reddick, arrived from Jackson the following day. She stood before local reporters on the courthouse steps, her hands clasped tightly around a folded statement. Her voice did not tremble, but her eyes did. She thanked the town for helping in the search and asked anyone with information to come forward. It was the only time she spoke publicly. After that, she withdrew from attention, visiting the sheriff's office quietly and returning home before dark. Each evening that week, residents gathered outside the courthouse with candles. The vigil lights flickered against the brick walls as the sheriff's deputies stood nearby in silence. Someone placed a small bouquet of daisies by the courthouse steps, Susan's favorite flower, and by morning, dozens more had joined it. The following Friday, the post office reopened. Mail had to move again, though the rhythm was not the same. Susan's station remained untouched, her chair pulled back as if waiting for her return. Someone had placed a single white envelope on her counter, sealed but blank. It stayed there for days before being removed quietly by a co-worker. Inside the office, the air felt heavy. The new clerk worked slowly, careful not to disturb the arrangement of pens, paper, and rubber stamps that Susan had left behind. People arriving to collect their mail lingered longer than usual, their eyes drawn to her empty chair. In small towns, absence is loud. It echoes through the simplest things: the space behind a counter, the name no longer called at roll, the morning route that now passes her house without stopping. The investigation continued, but the heart of Brookhaven had changed. Life went on in measured silence, each routine carrying the weight of what was missing. Every letter that passed through, the window after that carried her. Absence. The first real suspect emerged only a week after Susan Reddick vanished. He was a local mechanic, well known in town, with a record of assault from years earlier. Investigators searched his property, lifted fingerprints from his workshop, and questioned him for hours. He denied ever seeing Susan that morning. His alibi, repairing a customer's truck at the time she disappeared, was confirmed. The evidence cleared him, but not the town's suspicion. Next came a truck driver who had been seen passing through Brookhaven on the same day Susan's car was found. His rig matched the vague description of the light-colored pickup mentioned by several witnesses. He was brought in for questioning, his route traced from county to county. But the timeline did not fit. Logbooks and fuel receipts showed he was nearly 70 miles away at the critical hour. The sighting had been mistaken. Another lead dissolved. In early summer, attention shifted again, this time toward a man who had argued with Susan days before she vanished. He had been a regular customer, known for his temper. The argument, overheard by two others in line, had been brief but sharp. Investigators hoped it was a clue. They interviewed him twice, searched his truck, even administered a polygraph. He passed every test. The tension between them had been about a lost package, nothing more. Weeks became months. Witness statements blurred into repetition. Every possible angle, co-workers, neighbors, delivery drivers, was reviewed, logged, and filed. The forensic evidence, limited from the start, offered no progress. The shoe print found near her car had faded beyond use, and the partial fingerprints inside her vehicle matched no one in the database. The investigation lost its momentum. Each new report sounded like an echo of the one before it. Detectives retraced steps, compared notes, and re-examined fibers already tested twice. Nothing changed. The mailbags, the broken wristwatch, the scattered letters. All silent. By the start of 1993, the case file had grown thick but hollow. Dozens of interviews, hundreds of pages, no answers. The sheriff's department continued to field tips, each one weaker than the last. A stranger seen at a gas station, a rumor about a drifter, a name scribbled on an unsigned note. Every call led nowhere. The community, once restless with fear, began to quiet. New events took over the headlines. Life in Brookhaven returned to routine, even as the questions remained. Inside the station, the case board was cleared to make room for new investigations. One cold morning in late 1993, the evidence box, marked in black ink, Reddick, Susan, missing, was sealed. A clerk logged it into storage, placed it on a shelf among other forgotten cases, and closed the door. For the detectives who had spent months chasing answers, the closure felt more like surrender. The lead investigator, a man who had worked the case from the first day, submitted his resignation weeks later. In his final report, he wrote only one line at the bottom of the page. Sometimes cases just fade into the files. By early 1994, the Reddick investigation had been reduced to a single file folder and a sealed evidence box. The desks that once held maps, photographs, and transcripts were cleared. The investigators who once spoke Susan Reddick's name daily now moved to other cases. The quiet settled in like dust. Brookhaven began to heal in slow, invisible ways. The post office reopened under new management. Susan's desk was reassigned. Her key to the supply cabinet still hung on a small hook in the corner, untouched for weeks before someone finally took it down. The town learned to live around her absence. Children grew up hearing her story in fragments, whispered at church gatherings, or mentioned by parents who still lowered their voices when passing the old library. Her house on Pine Street stood empty for nearly a year before being sold. The new owners repainted the shutters, but neighbors said they never used the front porch. It was the same spot where Susan had once sat each evening with a book and a cup of tea. As years passed, the memories faded, softened by time and routine. The memorial bench placed outside the library bore her name, Susan Reddick, in kindness and service. It became part of the scenery, unnoticed by most who walked by. Inside the sheriff's department, the Reddick file was occasionally pulled from storage. A new detective would study it, often with hope and curiosity, only to return it weeks later. Each generation of investigators believed they might find something others had missed. But every clue still led nowhere. The evidence, collected in 1992, belonged to another era, before digital databases, before modern DNA profiling. In 2001, the department upgraded its evidence system. Boxes from old cases were catalogued and transferred to a climate-controlled room. The Reddick box was moved once again, its label rewritten in cleaner ink. Reddick. Susan. Missing person. 1992. The objects inside had not changed. The broken wristwatch, the scattered letters, the fibers sealed in plastic, the soil sample from beside her car tire. Time had turned them into relics. Forensic technology advanced rapidly, but the small town's resources did not. State labs were overburdened. Cases with active suspects took priority. Cold cases like Susan's remained on waiting lists that stretched for years. By 2008, few in Brookhaven spoke her name at all. The town had grown slightly. A few new stores, a renovated courthouse, yet nothing truly replaced what had been lost. Her sister Linda moved to Jackson but returned every spring to visit the memorial bench. She left a single white flower and sat in silence for a few minutes before leaving again. The original detectives had all retired by then. Some passed away, others moved to different states. The lead investigator who had once written that cases fade into files was living quietly on the Gulf Coast. When interviewed decades later, he admitted he still thought of her, mostly when he saw old mail trucks on the road. In the sheriff's archive, the Reddick case sat untouched for nearly a decade. The box gathered a thin layer of dust, but its edges stayed sharp, sealed by careful tape. A label reading "Do Not Discard" was added in 2012. After a routine audit nearly marked it for disposal, the town aged. The library replaced its card catalog with computers. The post office switched to digital systems. The new employees there barely recognized the name that had once defined the place. Then, in 2018, change arrived quietly. That year, Mississippi established a statewide cold case unit, a new division dedicated to re-examining unsolved homicides and disappearances using digital forensic tools. The unit was headquartered in Jackson, staffed by younger investigators trained in data analytics and advanced DNA analysis. Boxes from across the state began arriving in batches. Old cases long forgotten were reopened, their evidence digitized and logged into a new system. Among the first to be reviewed was the Reddick file. The evidence box was shipped from Brookhaven to the state lab. Technicians opened it carefully, recording every item on camera. The contents were familiar: the cracked watch, the purse, the letters still stained with dust. But the most important pieces were the sealed envelopes containing fiber and DNA samples, each one labeled by hand from the early 90s. On the second day of review, a technician named Officer Carla Mendez began scanning barcodes into the digital database. One envelope caught her attention, smaller than the rest. its handwriting faint but legible. The label read, "Partial female sample, unknown male match pending." The note beneath it, written in faded blue ink, said only, "To be tested when technology allows." Carla paused, reading the words twice. She looked at the date, May 1992. It was a trace sample collected from Susan's car, too small to be processed at the time. The notation suggested that early analysts believed it contained both the victim's DNA and a partial male profile. But the technology to separate and identify it had not existed in 1992. Now it did. Carla logged the envelope into the new system, assigning it a fresh barcode. She placed it carefully into the queue for reanalysis under the cold case unit's priority review category. As she sealed the evidence tray, the lights in the lab reflected against the clear plastic, illuminating the faded handwriting, the only voice left from the original investigation. No one in Brookhaven knew it yet, but for the first time in 26 years, the silence around Susan Reddick's name was about to break. The envelope marked partial female sample, unknown male match pending, was placed in a temperature-controlled tray and sent to the Mississippi State Forensic Laboratory in Jackson. It was one of hundreds being re-examined that year, but the lab notes from 1992 intrigued the analysts. The sample was small, degraded, and mixed, the kind that old technology could never separate. Now, with next-generation DNA sequencing and Y chromosome isolation techniques, there was finally a chance. Technician Carla Mendez submitted the fragment to the analysis queue. The fibers, collected from inside the driver's seat fabric of Susan Reddick's car, were placed in a sterile hood and processed under magnification. The machine extracted what remained of the biological material, a faint trace nearly invisible, and began sequencing it overnight. Hours passed as digital readouts built fragment by fragment. By morning, the computer displayed a faint but usable profile, female markers belonging to Susan Reddick, and faintly intertwined a second pattern, male. The lab supervisor reviewed the results twice before signing off. The recovered YSTR, Y chromosome short tandem repeat, was strong enough to enter CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. It was a long shot, but the unit was built for this kind of hope. The analyst entered the data and initiated the upload. The screen flickered as the system compared the new entry against thousands of stored profiles from across the country, convicted offenders, arrestees, and forensic samples from other cases. For nearly an hour, the cursor blinked on the screen. Then, at 10:42 a.m., the result appeared. CODIS hit. Match found. Louisiana Department of Corrections. The name beneath it froze everyone in the room. Subject: Royce Delmar offense, parole violation. 2016 current status, released. Residing in northern Louisiana. The lab fell silent. Mendez printed the result and carried it to the supervising officer, Detective Lieutenant Marcus Hale, who had recently joined the cold case unit. He read the name aloud once, softly, then again, slower. Royce Delmar had once worked for the Postal Service, briefly, back in the late 1980s, as a substitute driver on rural delivery routes across southern Mississippi. Personnel records showed that he had worked in Brookhaven for several months, overlapping with Susan Reddick's tenure. Until that moment, his name had never appeared anywhere in the original investigation. The team began to cross-reference details. Old postal employment logs confirmed it. Royce had filled in for regular drivers when Susan worked the counter. His file noted a resignation in 1989, citing personal relocation. They searched further. In 1994, he had been questioned in another state for a theft case but never charged. In 2016, he served a short prison sentence in Louisiana for parole violation, a domestic dispute turned minor assault. That arrest had required a DNA sample. It was that entry, uploaded into CODIS, that triggered the match now flashing on the Mississippi screen. The realization spread through the cold case unit slowly, almost reverently. After 26 years, the trace that had lingered on a car seat had finally spoken. Detective Hale began assembling an interagency task group. Contact was made with the Louisiana State Police and the FBI Regional Field Office in Baton Rouge. They confirmed that Royce Delmar, now 61, was living under a different name, Royce Dana, in a small town near Natchitoches, Louisiana. The forensic report was double-checked by an independent lab in Georgia. The results matched exactly. The male DNA profile found in Susan's vehicle was a 1 in 1.2 trillion likelihood match to Delmar's sample on file. As the findings circulated through official channels, the atmosphere inside the Mississippi Cold Case Unit changed. After years of quiet, there was purpose again. Every phone call mattered. Every note in the old case file was revisited, now with a name attached to it. The original evidence photographs were scanned anew. In one image, a grainy shot of the car's driver's side door, analysts noticed a faint handprint smudge above the window frame. Too faint for identification in 1992, but possibly useful now. Plans were made to reprocess it with modern enhancement tools. The story that had haunted Brookhaven for decades was no longer just memory. It was a trail, real and living, leading across state lines. By the following week, Detective Hale had secured authorization to open a renewed investigation under joint jurisdiction. Background checks revealed that Delmar had changed his name shortly after moving to Louisiana in the late 1990s. He worked as a groundskeeper at a local farm, kept to himself, and had no current criminal record beyond the old parole case. The final report for the week closed with a single entry, match confirmed. Subject located. Prepare for field verification and interview. The team began assembling travel plans, vehicle registration checks, property searches, and contact coordination with Louisiana authorities. Each step was careful, procedural, deliberate. For the first time since April 1992, the Reddick case had direction. The faces around the conference table reflected something no one wanted to name aloud, the feeling that the ghost of Brookhaven might finally have a voice. As Detective Hale reviewed the file late that evening, he turned to the old evidence photo of Susan's abandoned car. The broken wristwatch, the scattered letters, the stillness. He whispered her name once, then closed the folder. Somewhere in northern Louisiana, a man who had once delivered mail in Brookhaven was about to receive a knock on his door. Detective Marlon Tate joined the Mississippi Cold Case Unit in early 2019. He had a reputation for meticulous work, a habit of retracing old steps with patience few others possessed. When the Reddick file was assigned to him, it was more than paperwork. It became a puzzle he could not leave unsolved. Tate began by reviewing every document in the evidence box. He scanned hundreds of pages, interview transcripts, police logs, photographs, and lab reports from 1992. Each note carried the weight of time: smudged fingerprints, yellowed paper, fading ink. He cataloged every detail digitally, creating a master timeline from the morning Susan disappeared to the day the case went cold. Next, he reached out to witnesses from the original investigation. Most had aged 27 years. Some could recall little, others remembered fragments they had thought insignificant. Tate listened carefully, recording every recollection without judgment. He spoke with former postal employees, neighbors, and customers, comparing their accounts against the original reports. Retired officers from the Brookhaven Sheriff's Department were also interviewed. They offered procedural insights, how evidence was collected, which leads were prioritized, and where lapses had occurred. Tate noted discrepancies, fingerprints misfiled, witness statements incomplete, and a few observations never fully followed up. One afternoon, while going through an old set of handwritten notes, Tate discovered a detail previously overlooked. A gas station clerk on Highway 84 had been interviewed in 1992. The clerk's statement, buried in a subfolder labeled Miscellaneous Tips, described seeing Susan arguing with a man near a blue sedan, not a pickup truck, around 8:30 a.m. on the day of her disappearance. At the time, investigators dismissed it, assuming it was unrelated. Tate examined the clerk's description in detail. Male, mid-30s, slender build, short dark hair, wearing a Postal Service-style jacket. The clothing matched the records for Royce Delmar when he worked in Brookhaven in the late 1980s. Tate cross-referenced it with employment logs and verified that Delmar had been in town on delivery routes that morning. Every connection was methodical, procedural. Tate did not speculate. He catalogued facts. The timeline was reconstructed hour by hour. Susan arriving at the post office, her interactions with customers, the last confirmed sighting at the counter, and the journey of her abandoned Buick to the old church. The gas station sighting filled a gap in the timeline that had remained unresolved for nearly 3 decades. He re-examined the forensic evidence alongside modern DNA reports. The male profile extracted from fibers in the car matched Delmar. Tate ensured that every note, photograph, and trace evidence entry was cross-checked. Every overlooked detail was reanalyzed, producing a cohesive narrative. Meanwhile, Tate coordinated with the Cold Case Unit's lab team to confirm procedural accuracy. The evidence from 1992 was still intact, and modern testing confirmed previous results. The combination of witness accounts, employment records, and the CODIS match strengthened the case beyond circumstantial levels. Tate prepared preliminary arrest documentation. He contacted Louisiana authorities to confirm Delmar's current residence and background. Coordination required precise communication, property addresses verified, names cross-checked, and chain of custody reports updated. Every procedural step followed protocol. The detective's work was methodical, patient, and unwavering. There were no dramatic confrontations, only careful reconstruction, filing, and analysis. He reviewed every lead that had been dismissed and every witness whose account had been underappreciated. By late 2019, Tate had assembled a full package for the arrest warrant. The documents outlined Delmar's previous employment overlapping with Susan's, witness statements describing him near a blue sedan on the morning she disappeared, the male DNA profile recovered from Susan's vehicle, and all prior investigative records. The Cold Case Unit held a final briefing to review the compiled evidence. Officers from Mississippi and Louisiana law enforcement were present, confirming all details and coordinating jurisdictional authority for the upcoming arrest. As the team filed into the briefing room, Tate held the folder in his hands. Every sheet told a story of methodical investigation, decades of silence, and the relentless attention to detail required to bring a decades-old case to light. Outside the courthouse, the quiet streets of Brookhaven carried the memory of Susan Reddick, still absent, but no longer forgotten. Inside, the detectives were poised for action. The arrest warrant was signed, ready for execution. The next step would be decisive, a carefully planned move across state lines to confront a man who had, for nearly 30 years, remained out of reach. Tate knew the investigation had brought them here through patient diligence, and the moment to close the gap between evidence and accountability had arrived. Royce Delmar was 62, quiet and unassuming. For nearly 3 decades, he had lived under a different name, Royce Allen. Neighbors described him as polite but reserved, someone who kept to himself, tending to his small garden and working at a local warehouse in northern Louisiana. No one imagined he had a connection to Brookhaven, Mississippi, or to the disappearance of Susan Reddick. Records revealed a history that, on paper, seemed ordinary. Minor thefts as a young man, a dismissed assault charge in the late 1980s, and short-term employment at various postal and delivery services. Nothing had raised serious suspicion until the Cold Case Unit reopened the Reddick investigation. Investigators combed through employment records, old personnel files, and witness statements. They found that Delmar had abruptly left Brookhaven just days after Susan vanished in April 1992. Co-workers recalled him telling them he was heading west, with no explanation or forwarding address. At the time, no one pressed for details. He disappeared from town quietly, leaving behind only faint traces, a blue jacket left in a locker, and an empty desk at the post office. Over the years, he had created a double life. Under the alias Royce Allen, he secured employment at a warehouse, living in modest comfort. His daily routine was unremarkable, clocking in, handling inventory, and keeping to himself. There were no criminal incidents, no disputes with neighbors, no indication of the crime that had tied him to Brookhaven decades earlier. DNA evidence changed everything. The male profile recovered from fibers in Susan's car matched Delmar with a statistical certainty beyond dispute. Investigators now had the sole suspect, a man who had once been in proximity to Susan, who had access to her routines, and who had vanished from the town immediately after her disappearance. Detective Marlon Tate and his team coordinated with Louisiana law enforcement to plan the arrest. Surveillance was conducted over several days. Officers confirmed Delmar's residence and monitored his movements, noting his patterns, daily trips, and interactions. Every precaution ensured the operation would be controlled and safe. On a cool morning, the team moved in. Tate and deputies from both states approached the small home quietly. Delmar exited his house carrying a briefcase and keys. He paused briefly, adjusting his jacket, unaware of the officers watching from across the street. At the signal, law enforcement converged. He was approached calmly, instructed to place his hands behind his back, and taken into custody without incident. Neighbors emerged from their homes, some shielding children's eyes, others staring in disbelief. Royce Delmar, the man who had walked quietly among them for decades, was now a suspect in a 26-year-old cold case. Inside the vehicle transporting him to the Louisiana State Police Station, Delmar remained composed. He offered no explanation, no protests, no sudden revelations. The only evidence linking him to Susan Reddick had already been confirmed through DNA and his connection to Brookhaven. The narrative had shifted from possibility to certainty. Back in Brookhaven, officers and investigators reviewed the arrest notice. Old case files were brought out of storage once again. Witness statements, employment records, photographs, and the broken wristwatch from Susan's abandoned car were all cross-referenced. Everything now fit a grim, methodical timeline. Delmar's presence in town, his sudden departure, and the DNA evidence converged into a single conclusion. He was Susan Reddick's abductor. Neighbors who had once waved at Royce Allen now struggled to reconcile the quiet man they knew with the suspect revealed by decades-old evidence. The arrest was quiet, procedural, and without drama, yet its impact rippled through both communities. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, the Reddick family had a name. A single man could now be held accountable for the disappearance of the woman who had delivered letters, remembered birthdays, and shaped the rhythm of life in Brookhaven. Outside the warehouse where Delmar worked, and in the quiet streets of northern Louisiana, life continued. But for Brookhaven, the echo of Susan's absence was finally met with the certainty of justice moving toward resolution. Royce Delmar sat across from detectives in a small interview room in Baton Rouge. The table was bare except for a recorder, a copy of the DNA report, and the case file. His expression was calm, almost blank, but his hands fidgeted subtly on the tabletop. When first questioned, he denied knowing Susan Reddick. He claimed he had never been near the post office in Brookhaven in 1992. Investigators remained procedural, methodical, presenting evidence carefully, avoiding any suggestion or exaggeration. The DNA match was introduced plainly. Fibers from the interior of Susan's car contained male DNA, confirmed through modern forensic analysis, and linked directly to Delmar. For nearly an hour, he maintained his denial. The detectives, experienced and patient, allowed the silence to weigh. Then, when confronted with a sequence of details from witness accounts, employment records, and the timeline reconstructed by Detective Marlon Tate, cracks began to form. Delmar shifted in his seat. He admitted he had been in Brookhaven that April morning. At first, he claimed it was coincidental, that he had only returned to town for personal business. But when presented with the gas station clerk's statement, describing him arguing with Susan near a blue sedan, and the CODIS match, his composure faltered. Finally, he spoke. According to the transcript, his voice was low and deliberate. We argued. She found out I had been taking things, a misdelivered package. I panicked. I did not know how it happened. I struck her. I hid her near the river. I never wanted anyone to find her. The detectives documented the statement word for word. Each sentence was punctuated with pauses, as if he were reliving the events, but there was no embellishment, no dramatization. The confession was factual, brief, and chilling. Once the location was provided, a coordinated search was organized along the Pearl River, a few miles outside Brookhaven. Forensic teams followed Delmar's directions precisely, using modern recovery methods, metal detectors, sonar scanning, for waterlogged items, and ground-penetrating radar in areas with dense soil. Canine units were also deployed to detect human remains. Within 2 days, the search yielded results. Remains were recovered and transported to the State Forensic Lab. Dental records were compared against Susan Reddick's charts from the local dentist. Positive identification was confirmed. The lab report stated clearly, "Dental identification matches missing person Susan Reddick. Biological evidence corroborates identity." The case now had closure that had eluded investigators for 26 years. The confession, combined with DNA evidence and witness corroboration, provided a complete narrative of what had occurred that April morning in 1992. Detective Tate and the team maintained a restrained approach throughout the investigation and recovery. All documentation followed strict protocols: evidence logs, photographic records, forensic recovery sheets, and detailed timelines. The narrative of the confession was incorporated into the official report, verified by transcription review, and cross-referenced with all existing evidence. In Brookhaven, the news reached the sheriff's office quietly at first. The town had long accepted Susan's absence as an unresolved truth. When confirmation of her remains arrived, the community understood the extent of the revelation, the long silence, the decades of uncertainty, and the methodical unraveling of the mystery. Forensic photographs, evidence tags, and dental charts were compiled in a final case report. Each procedural step emphasized accuracy over dramatization. There was no sensationalism, only confirmation and clarity. The arrest and confession finally tied together the scattered elements of the case: the abandoned car at the church, the broken wristwatch, the scattered letters, the fibers in the vehicle, the witness statement from the gas station clerk, and the timeline reconstructed by detectives. For 26 years, Susan Reddick's route had ended abruptly at the post office and along the empty streets of Brookhaven. For decades, the town had carried the weight of uncertainty. Now, with Delmar's confession, her disappearance had an explanation. Her final resting place had been located, the perpetrator identified, and justice initiated. The detectives closed the file carefully, sealing the transcripts, forensic reports, and recovery documentation together. In the quiet office, Tate stared at the folder. No words were needed. The record itself carried the gravity. For 26 years, her route had never ended. Until now. News of Royce Delmar's arrest and confession reached Brookhaven quietly, first through the sheriff's office and local press. Residents, many of whom had known Susan Reddick personally, reacted with disbelief. A man who had once been a familiar figure in the postal community was now identified as her abductor. The post office, the center of Susan's daily life, reopened. A week later, with normal operations restored, but a noticeable somberness. Clerks and delivery drivers continued their routines. Yet every letter passed across the counter carried the weight of her absence and the knowledge of resolution. Law enforcement provided factual updates. Delmar was charged with abduction and murder, with the confession and DNA evidence forming the core of the case. Court proceedings were initiated in Louisiana, while Mississippi authorities coordinated to ensure the evidence chain remained intact for potential trial and extradition procedures. Statements from the sheriff and detective unit emphasized professionalism. The decades-long investigation had brought accountability, not closure in the emotional sense, but resolution in the legal and factual sense. In town, memorials quietly resurfaced. Residents left flowers and small tokens at the library bench bearing Susan's name. Friends and neighbors, who had long carried memories of her kindness, returned to gestures of remembrance, not celebration. Candles were lit at the courthouse steps, and a single letter addressed to the post office was left on her former desk, never opened. The post office dedicated a permanent plaque in Susan's honor. It was placed near the entrance, engraved with her name, years of service, and a simple note recognizing her devotion to the community. Employees and visitors could now see her contribution formally acknowledged. The plaque became a focal point, quiet but unmissable, a symbol of both loss and recognition. Court proceedings began with careful documentation. Testimonies confirmed Delmar's confession and the forensic findings. Each statement, each record, and every piece of evidence was handled precisely, emphasizing fact over dramatization. Local media reported the case with restrained tone, highlighting the decades-long investigation and the eventual identification of the perpetrator. Residents continued daily routines, though the collective memory of Susan remained vivid. Children passing the library bench, shoppers at the local grocery, and regular visitors to the post office all noticed her absence in a different way. Now with the knowledge that the truth, long concealed, had been revealed, law enforcement encouraged the community to understand the process. Decades of investigation, advancements in forensic science, and persistent detective work had finally led to a resolution. There was no celebration, only acknowledgement of diligence, patience, and procedural integrity. For Brookhaven, the end of the case brought a subtle shift. The streets remained familiar, the post office active, and the town returned to its routines. Yet every interaction, every glance at the memorial bench or the post office plaque, carried a renewed awareness of Susan's presence in memory. The final haunting visual remained at the post office. The plaque, polished and firmly mounted, bore her name. The letters were clear. Susan Reddick, found. It was a simple mark, factual and final, yet it resonated across the town. For the first time in 26 years, Susan's story had closure. Detective Marlon Tate sat at his desk one last time, reviewing the final report on Susan Reddick's case. Every page was accounted for: witness statements, forensic analyses, confessions, and evidence logs spanning 26 years. Each document represented a step toward resolution, a methodical progression from unanswered questions to verified facts. The report summarized the chronology concisely. April 1992, Susan Reddick disappears after her shift at the Brookhaven post office. Investigators locate her abandoned vehicle at the old church. Leads, rumors, and false suspects occupy the years immediately following. By 1994, the case is archived as cold. Evidence is preserved but dormant. In 2018, the statewide cold case unit re-examines the files. DNA analysis links Royce Delmar to the fibers in her car. By 2019, investigative reconstruction confirms his involvement. Arrest, confession, and recovery of remains follow. Tate's notes emphasized the persistence of procedural diligence. The breakthroughs were not sudden or sensational. They were the result of careful archival review, witness re-interviews, cross-referencing employment records, and advancements in forensic technology. Every fact was documented and every step verified. The cost of silence over decades was evident in the community. Brookhaven continued outward routines, but traces of Susan's absence lingered in daily life. The post office desk left empty for years, the memorial bench at the library, and the quiet recollection of neighbors who remembered her name. The passage of time neither erased her presence nor diminished the importance of the investigation. Forensic science had evolved significantly since 1992. Techniques unavailable at the time, YSTR analysis, next-generation sequencing, and advanced DNA profiling, were decisive in resolving the case. They provided clarity where decades of investigation had reached dead ends, demonstrating the role of technology in uncovering long-buried truths. Tate closed the file with an administrative note: case resolved. Suspect identified, confession obtained, remains recovered. Evidence verified and archived. The language was factual, restrained, and final. There was no embellishment, no dramatization, only confirmation of the sequence of events and the accountability achieved. The quiet persistence of justice was underscored by the meticulous steps that led to resolution. Community memory, too, had endured. Even after decades of uncertainty, Brookhaven's residents carried fragments of Susan's presence, through conversation, memorials, and the routines she had once shaped. Each gesture reinforced the continuity of memory in the town's social fabric. For investigators, the case illustrated the importance of thorough documentation, preservation of evidence, and patient review. Every overlooked note, misfiled record, or degraded sample held potential significance. Tate's methodical approach ensured that these remnants of the past could be leveraged to achieve justice when the tools finally allowed it. Susan Reddick's story closed not with fanfare, but with procedural integrity. Her disappearance, the subsequent investigation, the long silence, and eventual resolution were recorded carefully, forming a complete record for law enforcement, historians, and the community. In Brookhaven, life continued. Mail routes resumed their rhythm, customers visited the post office, and the days moved forward as they always had. Yet the presence of history remained embedded in routine, in memory, and in the acknowledgement of facts finally brought to light. In Brookhaven, the mail moves again, and every letter carries the weight of a promise that some stories never stay buried.